What was the general feeling by Southerners about Longstreet after the Civil War? Well, Longstreet was a guy who was the only one responsible for the loss of the cause and a traitor because he served the Republicans as surveyor of customs for the port of New Orleans when Grant became president. What was Pocahontas's relationship with Chief Powhatan? She was his daughter. What did the doctors do to Washington as he lied dying? Well, they immersed his feet in warm water, wrapped his throat with medicated compressive, drained his blood, applied an irritant, concocted a vaporizer, gargled mixture of molasses, vinegar, and butter, 2 laxatives. Okay, most of the experts on the Civil War seem to agree that one of the biggest reasons the South lost was, of course, because they were outmanned and outclassed at almost every point militarily. Why did Pocahontas die? She died, or when did Pocahontas die? She died in 1617? At 22 years of age. How long did Jefferson live in Monticello? Well, he lived in Monticello for about 60 years. It was 44 years that it was actually built. So how did Jefferson claim what his delight was? Well, his delight was architecture. What did Jefferson do in France for 5 years in the 1780s? Well, he did diplomatic missions, but observed Roman buildings and French neoclassical architecture. When did Thomas Jefferson die? Well, he died on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, which is 1826, at age 83, the same day that John Adams died. According to Edwin Beers, the North had 22 million people and the South had 9.5 million people. But how many slaves? 3.5 million slaves were in the South. 3.5 million, that is. Jefferson had a daily ritual. His daily ritual was bathing his feet in ice-cold water in the morning, then writing letters and reading before the sun rose, then breakfast and with the family, then return to reading and correspondence review work with the slaves, ride horses around the property for 6 to 8 mile ride to observe work, then return for an early dinner, conversation with guests if there were any, or spend time with family, tea with family or guests for hour. 9 p.m. retire to the bedroom. That was his routine. When George Washington left office after his second term, how old was he? Well, he was about 65 years old. The rescue of John Smith by Pocahontas took place in what year? It took place in 1607. So 1607 is quite an important year in this time. After Pocahontas' baptism, her Christian name was Rebecca. Who was Lee's old war horse? Lee's old war horse was James Longstreet. Lee is a right-hand man of Lee. Why did the interior of Jefferson's home, what did the interior look like? It employed a pleasing mixture of finely furnished and generally well-lit octagonal and rectangular rooms. Quite a masterpiece. What helps influence Washington to retire when he did? Well, he thought he was going to die soon. Family all died at early ages. Penn at the age of 17, and it was expelled from which college? Which college was Penn expelled from? Oxford, in London, England. Why did George Washington die? Well, he died. When? Gosh, 10:30 p.m. December 14th, 1790. So he died in 1799 at 67 years old. So it was only a couple years after he left office there. What does Monticello mean? It means little mountain. Monte is mountain. Cello means little. What was the effect of the Battle of Gettysburg? Well, Lee lost 30% of his entire army. Which author claims superior leadership was the reason for the Union victory? Well, James N. McPherson seems to believe that the Union won because leadership was the reason. What tragic event happened in the Longstreet family in January 1862? Well, 2 sons and 1 daughter died of scarlet fever in the Longstreet family. Regarding Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, who said, "I don't want to make this attack. I believe it will fail"? Longstreet. Your boy Longstreet was not, it was kind of going against the grain on every front, and his family died. What date did Pocahontas marry a 28-year-old widower? 1614. That was 1614 that Pocahontas married a 28-year-old widower. Along with Longstreet, who was considered Lee's finest subordinate officer? Stonewall Jackson. Stonewall Jackson was really subordinate for Lee. Pocahontas' real name was Matoaka. Matoaka, M-A-T-O-A-K-A. Who was Longstreet's best friend at West Point? Well, it was Ulysses S. Grant, so they were best buds. So he was a Republican from the start, for real. What was the first war that Longstreet would fight in after his West Point days in the 1840s? Well, the Mexican War in May of 1846. The Mexican War. the Second Mexican War, I guess that would be. How many children did Miss Longstreet give birth to, even though only 5? Man, Longstreet's all over this thing. Even though only 5 lived to adulthood. Well, 10 children. 10. 10 children did Longstreet have, and only 5 of them lived to adulthood. What date did Pocahontas, her husband, and child travel to England? Well, they went to England around 1616. How many slaves did George Washington eventually own? Washington owned more than 300 slaves. In the Penn article, what was the official name of the Quakers? Well, the Quakers were called the Society of Friends in the Penn article. Which religious group controlled Boston for most of the 17th century? Well, that would obviously be the Puritans, because Massachusetts was Puritan territory for sure. Who were Union commanders from the article on the Civil War? Well, Grant, obviously, Sherman, Sheridan, and Thomas. That's Grant, Ulysses S. Grant, William T. Sherman, Philip Sheridan, George Thomas. So Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, Thomas. Grant, Sherman, Sheridan, Thomas were Union commanders from the Civil War. Today, it's still common to see a likeliness of Penn on what? Well, Quaker Oats cereal. He's on Quaker Oats, obviously. Who wrote No Cross, No Crown? William Penn. William Penn wrote that one. William Penn wrote No Cross, No Crown. When did James Longstreet die? Well, that's a good question. When did James Longstreet die? He died on January 2nd of 1904 at 83 years old. So Longstreet lived a while. 1904. He lived a while. Longstreet did. How did Longstreet do at West Point? Well, he was great. Yeah. Well, actually, he was a mediocre student. At the bottom third of all of his classes, ranked 54th in a class of 56. So he did actually pretty terrible. Longstreet did. He was not very good at West Point. What were some Quaker beliefs? Well, the Quakers believed that all people were equal in God's eyes, and that there was that of God in every man. So, he kind of lived in all of us, was their thought. Jefferson could read in which language? Well, he could read Greek, Latin, Anglo-Saxon, which is freaking English, Greek, Latin, English, French, Spanish, and Italian. Greek, Latin, Italian, and Spanish, and French. So we're talking every type of Romantic language on the book. And then you've got English. Who founded the Quakers? Well, it was obviously George Fox. George Fox was the founder of the Quakers long before William Penn. The king wanted to name Pennsylvania after Penn's father, but William wanted to call it what? New Wales. So Penn actually was opposed to naming it after his own father, Pennsylvania. He wanted to call it New Wales because he was from Wales. How long did Penn actually spend in America in the New World? Well, Penn didn't spend that much time. He spent less than 5 years. Penn was not here very long. What killed William Penn? Well, he had a stroke. William Penn had a stroke. How did Longstreet's fellow corpsman call him? Well, he called him Old Pete. Old Pete. So his name was Pete, I guess. Longstreet's fellow corpsman called him Old Pete. Old Pete was Longstreet's name. Which author said that one advantage of the South is that they were united in one cause that they knew they were fighting for? Robert Crick. Robert Crick was the author that said that one advantage of the South was that they were united for their cause. That was something the Union couldn't say, and that was Crick. Crick said that. How old was Pocahontas when she died? Well, she was 22. She was 22 when she died. What usual thing happened to Longstreet during the Civil War period? Well, for 9 days he held commissions in both armies. So he was a member of both armies for 9 days in the Civil War. Longstreet. So this is really quite a unique guy. The King Penn petitioned for a grant of land in the New World. Well, Penn petitioned the king for a grant in the New World, and this king was King Charles, of course. What was the name of Pocahontas' only child? Well, Pocahontas' only child was named Thomas because, of course, she was now a Christian and her name was Rebecca. Which other fields in the South Morrill started going downhill after this in the Civil War as early as 1862? Well, Noah Andre Trudeau. So, which other fields in the South Morrill started going downhill? So Noah Trudeau started going downhill in 1862. How many future Civil War generals attended West Point along with Longstreet? Well, 16 of them, because West Point was really the premier college for military ventures. So 16 West Point grads went on to be fighting the Civil War with Longstreet. Who was the most responsible for the Pocahontas? Well, that was Pocahontas legend came from Captain John Smith primarily, not to be confused with John Rolfe, who was her husband. During the first few years in the New World, what was the relationship like between the Quakers and the Indians? The Quakers and the Indians, they really did get along. They got along over there. Where was the home of George Washington? Well, it was Mount Vernon, a home in Virginia, and he didn't actually live in the White House. Jefferson received a mastodon jawbone from which explorer, and he kept it in a museum in Virginia. Well, he received it from William Clark. William Clark, as in Lewis and Clark, gave him a mastodon jawbone, and he kept it in his museum in Virginia. How old was Maria Luisa Garland when she and Longstreet started courting? Well, she was about 17. Longstreet was far older than she was. Maria Garland was about 17 when Longstreet started courting her. At which battle was Stonewall Jackson shot by his own soldier in 1863? Well, that was the Battle of Chancellorsville. Chancellorsville caused Stonewall Jackson to be shot by his own soldier in 1863. It was quite a bad affair at Chancellorsville. Which author said that the most important reason the South lost was the determination of Lincoln to see it through to the end? Well, that'd be Davis. William Davis seemed to think that it was Lincoln's resolve that caused the South to lose. How did Longstreet die? Well, Longstreet died of pneumonia. A wound burst open and it had all kinds of blood everywhere. So it was pneumonia. It was probably a complication of pneumonia. What day did Pocahontas' only child born? Well, it was about 1615. This is 2 years before she died. Was Thomas born? Was in 1615. At the age of 76, Longstreet remarried 8 years after his first wife died. How old was the second wife on their wedding day? Well, she was about 34, which puts him a solid 40 years older than she is. Quite an interesting guy, to tell you the truth. So his first wife, who was quite little, died at a very young age, and he remarried very, very young at 76 years of age. 76. This is only 6 years before he would die. Why is there little known about Longstreet's 41-year marriage? Lost letters in a house fire in 1899. The Longstreet family history much of it was lost in 1889 in a fire. What did Longstreet's father do for a living? Well, Longstreet's father owned a cotton farm in Piedmont, in northeast Georgia. So Longstreet's father was a cotton farmer, and which is kind of what gave him roots in the South, even though he was kind of a Republican. Where did planters usually build their houses in the 18th century? Well, planters built their houses on or near rivers for ease in trading, because they wanted to be able to trade easier so they could make more money with less effort. So planters did not build them on mountains like Jefferson did. Which settler did Pocahontas eventually marry? Well, Pocahontas married John Rolfe, not to be confused with John Smith or John whatever else. She married Rolfe. After Grant assumed leadership for the Union Army, how long did it take him to defeat the Confederacy? Well, it only took him about a year. Grant was quite a great general. It took him about a year to defeat the entire Confederacy. Which author said it was never in the best interest of France or England to get involved in the Civil War? Well, Jefferson Davis, what? I'm going to throw this one out of court, because Jefferson Davis was not an author of one of those things, but he seemed to think that it's never in the best interest of France or England to get involved in the Civil War. From Why the South Lost the Civil War, who made the following statement? No. Okay, thank you. Okay. From Why the South Lost the Civil War, who made the following statement? Find out where your enemy is, get at him as soon as you can, strike at him as hard as you can, and as often as you can, and keep moving on. Well, that was Ulysses S. Grant. Quite a good leader. He said, find out where your enemy is, get at him as soon as you can, strike at him as hard as you can, and as often as you can, and keep moving on. That's what Grant said. What was the name of the first permanent North American colony in a European country? Well, that would be Jamestown. It would be Jamestown. First permanent North American colony from a European power. What was George Washington's dying wish? Well, he wished for a decent burial. He didn't want to be put in a vault less than 2 days after he was dead. He really wanted a decent burial. What was the style of Jefferson's home? Well, Jefferson was a classical Roman architecture Palladian villa. It was a classical Roman architecture Palladian villa. Classical Roman architecture Palladian villa. Which best describes Longstreet's philosophy or strategy on war? Tactical defense, and analytically and dispassionately, and preferred counterstrike to the attack. So Longstreet was kind of passive, but tactical. Which president was a Renaissance man? Of course it was Jefferson. Jefferson was, of course, a Renaissance man. Which country was William Penn arrested for blasphemy? Well, that was London, England. London, England. He was arrested for blasphemy, back when that was a thing. Where was the Civil War's first major engagement listed on the Longstreet's article? Well, the first major engagement, Blackburn's Ford, on Bull Run on the 18th. Where is Battle of Bull Run? Blackburn's Ford on Bull Run was the first major engagement in the Longstreet article. What lineage was the James Longstreet family? Well, they were about Dutch. They were Dutch. The Longstreet family was Dutch. Alright, so that's about it.